In the heart of the bustling city stood a glass tower that touched the sky, and at the very top of it lived Daniel Cross, a man who, to the world, had everything. His name was known in every business magazine. His face appeared at charity galas and award ceremonies, and people spoke his name with admiration and envy. He had built his fortune from nothing, rising from the dust of failure to the peak of success through sheer intelligence and determination. His mansion overlooked the skyline, filled with art, luxury, and silence. Every inch of it gleamed with perfection, but none of it felt like home. The marble floors echoed with his footsteps, the lights glowed bright but cold, and the sound of laughter had not been heard there in years. Daniel had learned long ago that success came with distance. People respected him, but few truly cared to know him. His phone never stopped ringing, but it was always for business deals, meetings, or investments, never for friendship, never for love. Even at crowded events, surrounded by people who smiled when he entered, Daniel felt the same dull ache in his chest, an emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. Every morning, he followed the same routine: coffee brewed by a housekeeper who never made eye contact, a car waiting at the door, and a line of employees ready to greet him with good morning, sir, as if they were programmed to say it. They all admired him, but none truly saw him. To them, he was a symbol of power, not a man with quiet loneliness tucked behind his confident smile. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized the tired eyes staring back. They were the eyes of a man who had everything he once dreamed of but lost something far greater along the way: peace. He had built his empire to escape the struggles of his past, but the higher he climbed, the more isolated he became. At night, he often sat by the massive window overlooking the glittering city below. The lights flickered like stars trapped beneath glass, each one a reminder of people living, laughing, and loving somewhere beyond his reach. He thought about the life he used to have, friends who believed in him before the fame, a family that had once been close, dreams that weren't about numbers or profit margins. But those were ghosts now, memories that lived only in the silence of his home. Sometimes, he told himself that this was the price of success, that loneliness was just part of the deal. Yet deep down, a quiet voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had been chasing the wrong kind of happiness all along. He didn't know it yet. But his world, built on steel, numbers, and pride, was about to be shaken by something he never expected. A few simple words from a girl who had nothing, yet owned everything he'd lost. The evening was heavy with rain, the kind that made the city shimmer under flickering streetlights. Cars lined the road in a slow, impatient crawl, their wipers sweeping away sheets of water that blurred the world outside. Inside his sleek black car, Daniel Cross sat in silence, his thoughts miles away from the traffic around him. The radio played softly, but he wasn't listening. His mind wandered to another endless meeting, another soulless dinner, another day that felt the same. As his driver slowed to a stop at a red light, Daniel turned his head toward the window and caught sight of something unexpected: a small figure moving through the rain. It was a girl, no older than 12, wearing a faded blue dress soaked through from the storm. She held a handful of roses, wrapped in old newspaper, her tiny frame trembling from the cold. Yet, even in that miserable weather, she was smiling, humming, a tune that somehow rose above the noise of the rain and engines. Daniel watched her weave carefully between cars, her shoes splashing through puddles as she knocked gently on windows, offering a flower and a polite smile. Some drivers ignored her, others waved her away, but she kept moving, unfazed. There was something about her, a spark of hope that didn't belong in such a dreary night. Before he knew it, Daniel rolled his window down, surprising even himself. The cold air rushed in, bringing with it the smell of wet asphalt and roses. The girl turned toward the sound, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Good evening, sir," she said cheerfully, her voice soft but full of life. "Would you like a rose? They're fresh." Daniel didn't usually entertain strangers, let alone street vendors, but something made him reach into his wallet. Without thinking, he pulled out a crisp $100 bill and held it out the window. The girl blinked, confusion crossing her face. "Sir," she said carefully, shaking her head, "that's too much for one flower." Her words caught him off guard. Most people would have taken the money and run, but she stood there in the rain, her honesty steady and sincere. Daniel found himself at a loss for words. "It's fine," he said, trying to wave it off, but she didn't move. Instead, she gave him a small, thoughtful smile, the kind that felt strangely comforting. "You look like someone who needs a smile more than a rose," she said. For a moment, Daniel just stared at her, unsure how to respond. Her voice wasn't mocking or bold. It was simple, gentle, and completely true. The light turned green, and cars began honking behind him. The girl quickly tucked a rose into his hand, then stepped back into the rain, her little figure disappearing among the sea of headlights. As the car drove forward, Daniel glanced at the single rose resting in his palm, red, delicate, and real. It wasn't the flower that stayed with him, but her words. In a city full of noise and greed, a child who had almost nothing had just given him something priceless. A moment of truth that would quietly follow him long after the rain had stopped. For the first time in months, Daniel felt something unexpected stir inside him, amusement. As the rain poured harder, the little girl stood there with her roses, waiting for his response with the same gentle confidence as if she had known him for years. A faint chuckle escaped his lips, surprising even himself. "What's your name?" he asked, leaning slightly out of the window. The girl's eyes sparkled under the streetlight as she answered proudly, "My name's Leela." There was something about the way she said it, not shy, not uncertain, just simple and full of life. Daniel nodded and said, "Lila, that's a nice name." She smiled wider, her teeth slightly uneven, but her joy so pure, it felt contagious. He bought a rose from her, the soft red petals trembling under the drizzle, and handed her the money again. "Keep the change," he said kindly, but she shook her head with a playful grin. "All right, but only because you smiled," she replied, holding the rose up like a little victory. For a man who was used to people fawning over him for wealth, that single sentence hit differently. She wasn't impressed by his suit or the car he sat in. She seemed to see something else entirely. As the traffic light turned green, Daniel expected her to walk away, but she leaned closer to the window and said something that froze him in place. "You look sad," she said softly. Her words weren't judgmental. They were innocent and full of concern, as though she were talking to a friend instead of a stranger. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "I'm fine," he replied quickly, masking the unease her observation caused. She tilted her head, studying him for a second, then smiled again. "You'll feel better soon," she said cheerfully. Before he could say another word, she stepped back and waved as the car began to move. Daniel watched her grow smaller in the side mirror, her figure fading into the blur of rain and headlights. That night, his penthouse felt even quieter than usual. The sound of the rain outside was steady, almost soothing. He placed the rose on the nightstand and found himself staring at it longer than he expected. Its petals were soft and fragile, yet something about it felt strong, like it belonged somewhere brighter. He fetched a glass of water and carefully placed the stem inside, as if afraid to ruin it. It was strange, almost absurd, that a flower given by a child he had met for only a minute had somehow found a place in his home, a place that had been empty for years. But what was even stranger was how her words refused to leave his mind. "You look sad." He turned off the lights and lay down, staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone so young and poor could see through him when no one else ever had. That night, for reasons he couldn't explain, Daniel slept with the faintest smile on his face, the first genuine one in a very long time. The next morning, Daniel found himself restless. His meetings no longer held his attention, and his mind kept wandering back to that little girl in the rain, her soft voice, her honesty, her simple smile. He couldn't explain why she stayed in his thoughts, only that she had left a strange warmth in a heart that had been cold for years. That evening, without fully realizing what he was doing, he asked his driver to take the same route as before. The city was alive again with noise and motion, but Daniel wasn't watching the buildings or the traffic. He was looking for her. As the car slowed near the same intersection, there she was, standing in the same spot, waving to each car that passed. The rain had stopped, and the fading sunlight turned the puddles into mirrors. Her blue dress was still faded, but she seemed brighter, somehow, like a little piece of light that refused to dim. Daniel lowered his window, and Lila's face lit up with recognition. "You came back," she said, her smile wide and genuine. Daniel laughed softly, a sound that felt foreign to him. "I guess I did," he said. "I wanted to buy another rose." She handed him one, but this time he didn't drive away. "Can I ask you something, Lila?" he said. She nodded eagerly, balancing her small basket against her hip. They began to talk, not like a businessman and a street vendor, but like two people who had accidentally stepped into the same quiet moment in a noisy world. She told him about her school, how she tried to attend when she could, and how her teachers said she was good at reading stories aloud. "But sometimes," she admitted, "I can't go because I have to help my mom." Her voice softened when she mentioned her mother. "She's sick," Lila said, "so I sell flowers after school to buy her medicine." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He wanted to ask more, but her cheerful tone stopped him. She didn't sound bitter or sad, just hopeful. "People think I'm poor," she continued, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, "but I have everything I need, my mom's love and my smile." Her words were simple, but they hit him like a wave. He had met thousands of people in his life, investors, partners, politicians, yet none of them had ever spoken with such purity. She wasn't ashamed of her life, and she didn't envy anyone else's. She seemed to understand something that Daniel, with all his wealth and education, had forgotten long ago. As they spoke, the traffic around them blurred into background noise. The girls' laughter filled the air, light and honest, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt lighter too. The weight he carried of loneliness, of endless ambition, seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. When the light turned green again, he didn't rush to leave. He wanted to stay in that small, fleeting moment, a stranger beside a child who somehow made the world feel whole again. Over the next few weeks, Daniel found himself taking detours he never used to take, the kind that led him past a flower stand. A bright smile, and a little girl who had unknowingly changed something inside him. Each time he saw Lila, the noise of the world seemed to fade a little more. Sometimes he brought her food, sandwiches neatly packed by his housekeeper, or warm soup on colder days, but Lila never accepted anything without offering him a rose in return. "A fair trade," she would always say with a grin. Other times, he came simply to talk. They would sit on a nearby park bench, surrounded by children playing and the distant sounds of the city. It became their quiet world, where a wealthy man and a poor girl shared stories that had nothing to do with money or success. Lila told him about her mother, who was sick but strong in spirit. "She always says to be rich in kindness, not coins," Lila said once, swinging her legs off the bench. Daniel had smiled faintly at that, though the words lingered in his mind long after. He had spent years chasing more power, more recognition, more profit. But sitting there beside this child, who had almost nothing yet radiated joy, he began to question everything he thought he knew about wealth. One afternoon, as golden sunlight spilled across the park, Daniel found himself asking her a question that had been sitting quietly in his heart. "Lila," he said gently, "do you ever wish for a better life?" A bigger house, more money, new clothes. She looked up at him with her usual wide-eyed calm, as if the question itself was strange. "But I already have a good life," she said simply. Daniel blinked, unsure how to respond. "How?" he asked softly. Leela smiled and looked toward the families walking by. "I get to make people smile every day," she said. "That's better than money, right?" Her answer was so innocent, yet so profound, that Daniel couldn't speak for a long moment. In his world, happiness was measured in numbers, sales, profits, bank balances. But Leela's world ran on something entirely different. She didn't have much, but she had peace. She didn't have riches, but she had purpose. Her mother's words, "Be rich in kindness, not coins," echoed in his mind, weaving themselves into his thoughts like a quiet melody he couldn't ignore. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Leela stood and brushed the dust off her dress. "I have to go now," she said, waving goodbye with a cheerful smile. Daniel watched her walk away, her small figure blending into the crowd. For the first time in years, he didn't feel lonely or lost. Instead, he felt grateful for a lesson taught not in boardrooms or books, but by a little girl with a basket of roses and a heart far richer than his own. Something in Daniel began to shift, quietly at first, like a gentle breeze moving through a still room. The more time he spent with Leela, the more he began to notice the small things he had ignored for years. The world, once a blur of meetings and phone calls, suddenly seemed full of faces and stories. One morning, as he entered his office, he noticed a janitor sweeping the lobby. The man looked up, startled, when Daniel greeted him first, with a smile and a good morning. It was such a simple exchange, but it left Daniel thinking the entire day. Later, he thanked his driver for waiting long hours, something he had never done before. The man's surprised grin reminded Daniel of Leela's words. That kindness didn't cost anything but could make someone's day richer. Even the receptionist, who always greeted him with a cheerful "Good afternoon, sir," seemed different now. Daniel realized it wasn't her job to smile. It was her choice. She smiled every day, and he had never once asked how she was doing. Now, he did. The look of gratitude in her eyes told him everything he needed to know about the power of small gestures. Lila's innocence had become a mirror, reflecting the parts of him that had been asleep for too long. Her laughter, her joy, her way of finding beauty in simple things. It had opened his eyes to a world that money had blinded him to. One evening, Daniel decided to visit the small hospital where Lila had told him her mother was being treated. He arrived quietly, without cameras or announcements. The hospital was old and understaffed, yet filled with warmth. He saw families sitting by loved ones, holding hands through pain, whispering words of comfort. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and hope. When he met Leela's mother, she was frail, but smiling. The same kind of smile her daughter carried, the one that didn't need words to heal. They talked for a while, and when he left, he made arrangements anonymously to cover her medical bills. It wasn't out of pity. It was gratitude. Leela had given him something he could never repay, a heart that could feel again. From that day, Daniel began donating quietly. No press, no public announcements, just silent acts of good. He funded school scholarships, helped struggling families, and supported shelters. But more than the money he gave, it was the time he spent that mattered most. He volunteered at the hospital, reading to children, or listening to patients' stories. Every time he saw a smile bloom because of something he did, he felt the same warmth he once felt sitting beside Leela in the park. Her words became his compass. "You're only rich when your heart gives." The empire he had built once stood on ambition. Now, it stood on compassion. And though the world still saw Daniel Cross as a powerful millionaire, he finally began to see himself as something far greater, a man learning how to live again. The morning felt strange from the moment Daniel woke up. The air outside was still, the city quieter than usual, and as he drove through the familiar streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Every day, for weeks, he had stopped by the same corner where Lila stood with her basket of roses and her bright, unshakable smile. But today, the spot was empty. The air that once carried her laughter now felt heavy, and the corner looked bare without her little figure waving at passing cars. Daniel asked his driver to circle the area again, then again, until the sun began to sink behind the tall buildings. Still, there was no sign of her. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, worry. Not for himself, not for his business, but for a child who had somehow become the brightest part of his life. As the hours passed, his unease grew into a quiet panic. Finally, he pulled over and stepped out of the car, rain beginning to fall softly, just like the night he had met her. He asked nearby vendors if they had seen the little girl who sold roses, and an old fruit seller looked up sadly. "The girl?" the man said. "Her mother passed away a few days ago. I think she went to stay at a shelter nearby." Daniel felt his chest tighten. Without another word, he got back in the car and told his driver to find the shelter. When they arrived, the building was small and worn, with peeling paint and a broken gate. Inside, children were playing quietly, their laughter soft but tired. A kind-looking woman greeted him, and when he asked for Lila, she nodded and led him down a narrow hallway. Lila was sitting near a window, her basket of roses beside her, though most of them had wilted. Her eyes were red, but when she saw him, she smiled, the same brave smile that had once stopped his world. "You came," she said softly. Daniel knelt beside her, unsure what to say. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that he would take care of her, that she would never have to sell flowers again. But before he could speak, she reached out and held his hand. "It's all right," she whispered. "You don't have to fix everything." Her voice was gentle, but her words struck deep. "You already helped me," she said. "You learned to smile again." Daniel froze, her words echoing in his mind. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The tears that he hadn't shed in years filled his eyes as he looked at her. This small, fragile girl, who had lost so much, yet carried more strength in her heart than most grown men. She wasn't thanking him for money or promises. She was reminding him of the one thing he had forgotten, that healing doesn't always come from wealth. It comes from love freely given. As he left the shelter that night, Daniel looked up at the stars breaking through the clouds and felt something powerful. Not sadness, not guilt, but gratitude. Lila had given him back his humanity, and he knew he would carry her words with him for the rest of his life. Years passed, and the world changed around Daniel Cross. But one thing never left his heart: the memory of a little girl who sold roses and taught him what wealth truly meant. The powerful businessman who had once lived in silence now spent his days surrounded by laughter and purpose. The mansion that had once echoed with emptiness was now alive with voices. The chatter of children, the shuffle of small feet running down hallways, and the faint sound of music drifting through the open windows. The paintings of luxury that once hung on his walls had been replaced with colorful drawings made by children whose lives had been changed by something beautiful. The Lila Rose Fund. The foundation had started as a small idea, a tribute to a girl who had given him more than he ever gave her. Its symbol was simple, a single rose in bloom, just like the ones Lila once carried in her basket, a reminder that kindness, even from the smallest hands, could grow into something that touched thousands. The fund built schools in poor neighborhoods, provided education to children who could not afford it, and offered homes to those who had none. Daniel made sure every classroom had a rose painted near the door, a quiet nod to the girl who had once stood on a rainy street corner and smiled through her struggles. Whenever reporters or donors asked what inspired him, Daniel never told the full story. He would simply smile, his eyes soft, and say, "A little girl once told me that kindness is the only real wealth." Those who knew him well said his voice always changed when he said those words, gentler, warmer, full of unspoken memory. Some nights, he would sit by the same window he once stared through in loneliness, a single rose placed in a glass of water beside him. He often caught himself wondering where life had taken her, if she ever knew what her kindness had done. But deep down, he felt that she did. The emptiness that had haunted him for years was gone. In its place lived something far more valuable, peace. Daniel no longer measured his success in profits or fame. He measured it in the smiles of children who got to dream again. The boy who cleaned shoes now attended university because of his scholarships. The little girl who once went hungry now painted murals at the foundation's center. Every story reminded him of her, of the one who had seen sadness behind his smile and offered him hope without asking for anything in return. As the sun set one quiet evening, Daniel walked through the garden behind his home, where roses bloomed in every shade. He paused by one particular bush, bent down, and plucked a single red rose. Holding it gently, he whispered, "You were right, Lila. Kindness really is the only real wealth." He placed the flower in the glass beside his bed, just as he had done all those years ago, and smiled. The rose glowed softly under the light, a living memory of a child's wisdom and a man's redemption, eternal, pure, and priceless.